Good morning. Welcome. I think a number of you are logging in from your various locations. We're going to wait a couple more minutes to get a few more people into the Zoom, and then we'll get started. So you are connected. We're glad you're here, and we'll be getting going in a couple of minutes. No, I'm on. Okay. Good morning. Welcome. I'm Tim Carrington, and on behalf of the Friends of St. Benedict, I want to say how happy we are that you're with us for this 9th annual Symposium on Benedictine spirituality. COVID rules apply, which means we don't have the good food, we don't have the hospitality and the conversation with each other. But we also don't have the travel complications, the worries about ice and snow, or the parking frustrations. The big positive of what we do have is Bonnie Thurston, our speaker. She's a scholar, preacher, poet. She joins us from her home in West Virginia, the state where she grew up. She's completely iced in, and had we counted on her to be here in person, we would have had to send a helicopter. Her subject, what Thomas Merton's monastic spirituality has to give us today, is something she knows about deeply. Bonnie wrote her doctoral dissertation on Thomas Merton and was a founding member of the International Thomas Merton Society, serving as its 3rd president. She has written over 50 articles or contributions to books on Merton and offered retreats and lectures on Merton widely in the US, Canada, the United Kingdom, and continental Europe. She edited Thomas Merton and Buddhism. She edited and worked on Hidden in the Same Mystery, Thomas Merton and Loretto, and her latest book on Merton, Shaped by the End You Live For, Thomas Merton's Monastic Spirituality, was published last year by Liturgical Press. It's a gem. Her work on Merton has been translated into Dutch, German, Italian, Japanese, and Spanish. The Friends of St. Benedict website will provide you a list of Bonnie's published works with links for ordering copies from the publishers. Bonnie has also had a broader abiding interest in the history of Christian spirituality and prayer. Her church affiliations include the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and the Episcopal Church of the United States. She was ordained in 1984 and has served as a co-pastor, a pastor, or an interim of 5 churches and twice served in overseas ministries. She has written books on the Beatitudes, on the Gospel of Mark, and on the gift of time. She's published half a dozen books of poetry. So let me set those accomplishments aside for a moment and say that Bonnie, like all the rest of us here, is trying to learn from the monastics about living a balanced and intentional life. A widow, she lives alone, following a rule of life incorporating the Benedictine basics of work, prayer, study, and rest. As Benedict would prefer, she lives on earth, not in the clouds. She weeds her garden. She replaces her tires and socks. She does her laundry. She understands that the ordinary life is holy because it is ordinary. Our symposium is happening because my friend Lane Wilson delved into the webinar mysteries and made them come to life for you this morning. Erica Angst got the word out to all of you and then supplied you with the links that have hopefully brought you in. We are in their debt, and we thank them both for their tireless acts of online hospitality. We don't enjoy a checkerboard of faces, but I believe that joining us from England is author, historian, and Benedictine scholar Esther Duval, who was the architect of the first Benedictine experience held in Canterbury 4 decades ago. Welcome, Esther. Also with us is Norveen Vest in Charlottesville, author of a guide many Benedictine groups in the US have worked with over the years. Norveen, we're very glad you're here too. And today, we want to recognize a particular friend of St. Benedict, Harriet Matthews, who left this world last month. Her longtime support of the Friends of St. Benedict and her glowing enthusiasm for the whole venture was critical to extending the idea that monastic wisdom and Benedictine balance was critical to all of us, and that it could help us hallow time and live intentional lives that rewarded us as they unfolded. Together with her great friend Betty Swenson, the founder of the Friends of St. Benedict, she kept the operation going, helping to organize programs in England, France, and a multiple of locations in the United States. Harriet greatly appreciated this yearly symposium, and even when travel became a little more difficult from her new home in Frederick, Maryland, she faithfully came down for the event. Last year, we didn't see her, and as health challenges multiplied, we understood that life had become a bit more difficult. We hoped that an online program this year would work for her, but that was not meant to be. So today, we dedicate this program to our friend Harriet and to her enthusiastic belief that we all had something to learn from monks we will never be. She would be so happy that each of you is here to take in and make use of the wonderful presentation that will follow. So one note, Bonnie's talks in two parts with a break in between, have been pre-recorded. That was for the safety of knowing that we had it and we could deliver it to you even if something went wrong with our Zoom connection. So you're going to see a very recently recorded talk that Bonnie made for you earlier this week, and then she will come in live to respond to your questions and comments. And so now it is, one other note. If for some reason your Zoom connection fails, the YouTube link is your backup. So you can go to the Friends of St. Benedict website and click on the YouTube and pick up with that. Also, if you want to watch it again, or you have a friend that was not able to come and join us this morning, that YouTube link is there for that purpose as well. Okay, it's great you're here. Thank you for Zooming in. And now I turn it over to Bonnie. Great to be okay. Thank you. Great to be here. Okay.
Angst for their technical skills for making this happen for us. The process is really simple, as Tim will probably have told you. There'll be a talk of half an hour or so, and then a little break when you can think about the talk and maybe use the questions if they're helpful to you. The ending time of the talk may be a little varied, but we will be beginning right on the money for the second talk and for the question and answer period. Merton is a good entree for us, I think, when we think about what monastic wisdom might have to say to us in these times. And I really want to just start with a little quotation from Saint Seraphim of Sarov, a Russian saint, Orthodox saint, that sort of is the overarching thing to think about in the talks. And it is, acquire the spirit of peace, and thousands around you will be saved. Acquire the spirit of peace, and thousands around you will be saved. I think one reason that Merton continues to be popular and to draw new readers and to keep old ones like me is that he has helpful and provocative things to say about important subjects. And I think the taproot among all of them is the spiritual life. His writings on social justice and ecumenism and interfaith and literature and art, all of that grew really from his monastic spirituality. And with a healthy measure of self-awareness, Merton wrote of himself in a 1964 journal entry, "My ideas are always changing, always moving around one center, always seeing that center from somewhere else." What interests me about this is Merton's insight. About Merton's insight is this phrase, always moving around one center. After 40 years or more of being an avid student and reader of Merton, it's my conviction that the center that Merton's thinking moved around was monastic life. And I'll stick my scrawny old neck out and really say that if we don't understand Merton as a monk, we don't understand Merton. There was no period in his life from his postulancy in 1941 until his death in 1968 that he was not writing and reflecting on monastic life. Certainly, his journals from the late 50s to about 1960 reflect kind of a disenchantment with Gethsemane. I'm not hiding that fact. That can happen to people who take vows involving stability, whether they are monastic or marital. You know, they're vows that are hard to keep, and we struggle with them sometimes. But Merton was not, I think, so much unhappy with monastic life during that period as he was jaded about where he was living it. And in contradiction to the vow of stability, he was kind of looking around for someplace else to live the vows. Of course, his abbot was wise, and the abbot general was wise. They didn't give him permission to move because, as we all know, wherever we go, we take ourselves with us. If Merton had moved, he would still have had a sense of disenchantment at some point. Wherever we go, that's where we are. And that's why isolation has been hard for some of us in the last year or so, because we are who we are, where we are. Merton's wisdom was essentially monastic wisdom, and that's true not only of his commercially published works on spirituality, not only the volumes of journals and letters and the massive teachings now being published of his lectures to his monks at Gethsemane, but of everything he wrote. And I want to just have a little aside and say that in this talk, monk is a gender inclusive term. So when I say monk, I'm not applying it only to males, but to men and women. And in the quotations, you're going to hear some not very inclusive language. And of course, Merton lived long before inclusive language was the norm. So please just do a little translation in your own head when you hear something like that. Well, right, you're probably thinking. It's pretty easy to be Mr. Monastic Polymath if you live in a place where you are fed and protected and everything is directed to God. We don't, or at least most of us don't. Most of us are not the few, the proud, the Cistercians. And anyhow, isn't withdrawing into a monastery what my generation would call a cop-out? That was certainly the critique of Merton by the feminist theologian Rosemary Radford Ruther, with whom Merton had a long correspondence. A lot of her letters to him are along the lines of, if you care so much about the world, get out of that medieval Christian ghetto and come and work with us out here in the big bad world. In fact, she wrote to him in March of 1967, and now I'm quoting, "We do not bring paradise out of the wilderness by taking off to the hills, but by struggling with the principalities and powers where we really are." Well, hers is a common view. Some of us may secretly think this is easy for him. He was a monk and a priest. What about the rest of us, poor souls? Well, I'm going to try to speak to the rest of us, poor souls. First, I want to explain why I think Merton did not feel that monasticism and its spirituality was a flight from the world. And then I want to suggest two ways that explicitly monastic spirituality have something to say to the rest of us. And in the course of today, you may discover that you are at some level a monk in disguise. So I'm going to talk a little bit about monasticism in the world, about ora et labora, the balance of life, or the balance of work and prayer, which involves something of silence and something of solitude. And all of this have behind it the challenge to most of us of choosing how we use our time. Most of us, in fact, do have more choice and than we engage. So let's talk about monasticism as engagement with the world. For Merton, the contemplative life and the active life of apostolic ministry or social action, peace and justice work were not separate, but they were two aspects of one life that informed each other. You'll remember he actually wrote a book entitled Contemplation in a World of Action. And he wrote in Thoughts in Solitude, I'm quoting, "A life is either all spiritual or not spiritual at all. Life is either all spiritual or not spiritual at all." The very helpful introduction to Wisdom of the Desert, the Merton's collection of the sayings of the 4th century desert Christians, is really helpful in our understanding of monastic spirituality for the world. Those really wonderfully quirky men and women went out into the desert to cure themselves. And that in order to cure the sick and crumbling world of the Roman Empire. We think we've got problems. Think about living in the demise of the Roman Empire. And now I'm quoting Merton. They, the desert monastics, did not believe in letting themselves be passively guided and ruled by a decadent state. They believed that there was a way of getting along without slavish dependence on accepted conventional values. So highlighted here are ruled by a decadent state and slavish dependence on accepted conventional values. One of the great abbots of the Cistercian tradition, the 12th century abbot of Persenia, taught people quoting, "Come to the monastery first to be cured. The period of monastic formation is a period of cure and convalescence. There's something about monastic spirituality that is intended to cure what ails us." Merton noted that the desert Christians, quote, "had to die to the values of transient existence as Christ died to them on the cross, and rise from the dead with him in the light of an entirely new wisdom." The process we're talking about is at the core of Christianity. It's the process of dying to something in order that we can rise to something better. One enters a monastery to die and be resurrected. And the idea is that the more resurrected people there are, the better the world will be. And that's true for us in the world. The more we can be persons who are resurrected, life-giving persons, the better the world around us will be. I want to read now two longer quotes from Merton, both of which will, I think, give us deeper insight into this idea that we embrace certain values in order to be cured, and that is for the health of the larger society. Here's how Merton described the desert Christian's process. "To leave the world is to save it by saving oneself. The Coptic hermits who left the world as though escaping from a wreck did not merely intend to save themselves. They knew they were helpless to do any good for others as long as they floundered around in the wreckage. But once they got a foothold on solid ground, things were different. They had not only the power, but the obligation to pull people to safety after them." Another quotation on the same idea. "The one who attempts to act and do things for others or the world without deepening his own self-understanding, freedom, integrity, and capacity to love will not have anything to give to others. He will communicate nothing but the contagion of his own obsessions, his aggressiveness, his ego-centered ambitions, his delusions about ends and means, his doctrinaire prejudices and ideas." Well, Merton really doesn't take any prisoners when he begins to talk about what he thinks the root problems are. To put this matter crudely, first by means of a slightly altered popular saying, is to say that really screwed up people can't straighten out the world. Or a more elegant way, which was said eons ago, "Physician, heal thyself and thou shalt heal the world." In Basic Principles of Monastic Spirituality, Merton wrote, "It would be an illusion to think that the monks could live entirely unrelated to the world. The monk is withdrawn from the world. He preserves an intimate spiritual contact with those with whom he is actually or potentially united in Christ." Right, you are thinking. So monks go off and pray for us. What's the connection to me? Well, it's the way Merton defined monk in the 1960s. In Talks for Asia in 1968, Merton defined the monk as a marginal person, somebody who is essentially outside establishments. The monk is a marginal person on the edges. Quoting Merton, He is a marginal person who withdraws deliberately to the margin of society with a view to deepening fundamental human experience. The monk is essentially somebody who takes up a critical attitude toward the world and its structures. The monk is somebody who claims that the claims of the world are fraudulent. End of quotation. A marginal person, someone critical of the structures in which he or she lives, somebody who sees fraudulency as fraudulency. In other words, to put it in my terms, the monk is the person who is the one who stands up in the meeting and says the emperor has no clothes on. Being marginal, being outside the camp, to use biblical language, is crucial to the camp. We who are marginal people are crucial to the people who are in the center, because the marginal person or the monk has distanced herself enough to see the world and to see its societies clearly. Merton wrote in Wisdom of the Desert, quote, "The desert Christians believed that to let oneself drift along passively, accepting the tenets and values of what they knew as a society, was purely and simply a disaster." End of quote. The desert itself, the image of being outside and marginal, and having really something important to contribute by a discreet and detached silence, I think really speaks to us in the situation that we're in now. But the desert silence gives those who go there with ears to hear and eyes to see, to quote Jesus, the power and obligation to pull the world to safety after them. In his last talk, Merton said, quote, "The monk belongs to the world, but the world belongs to him insofar as he has dedicated himself totally to the liberation from it in order to liberate it." We go to the edges, we go to the margins, we have a certain distancing from the way things are. And that is, in fact, a gift to the society. Monastic wisdom, I think, calls us and challenges us to think more expansively, especially as friends of St. Benedict, about what it might mean to be a monk. I certainly hope that there will always be traditional forms of monasticism, men and women who live together in communities under vows. But Benedict also has friends, like us. And Merton suggests that one can be a monk without leaving home by means of a certain intellectual and spiritual detachment from the way things are, whether we think of the way things are as being positive or negative. We have to bear in mind that our analysis of a situation may be determined by our own place and our own prejudices. The way things are, the conventional wisdoms are sometimes not always wise, and the usual way of doing things sometimes doesn't work very well. Monastic spirituality suggests that after we've done the work of cleaning up our own act, of seeking healing, the monk as marginal person sees the mainstream more clearly and offers it the gift of a new perspective. And the gift of the new perspective provides the opportunity for change. Change? Yes, change. Perhaps ironically, monasticism, vowed and enclosed or in the world, is an engagement with the world by a healthy detachment from it and skepticism about it. And we take this stand vis-a-vis the world precisely because we love it. You know, you and I only agonize over what we love. The rest of it we just blow off because we don't care really about it. In Thoughts in Solitude, Merton suggests our vocation is, quote, to love others with something of the purity and gentleness and hiddenness of God's love for us. It's a huge assignment. Once we understand that our deepest calling is to a spiritual life that heals us so that we can heal others, what is Merton's practical advice to us? Should we decide to take on the assignment? What's our program for conversatio morum, conversion of life? In the context of faithfulness to the commitments we have made, Merton's monastic wisdom commands to us a balanced life of prayer and work, and that, I think, includes a certain measure of silence and solitude. So let me sort of close off the morning's talk by thinking a little bit about ora et labora, the balance of prayer and work. The genesis of the Cistercian tradition, as you know, was a return to the principles set forth by Benedict in his rule. The Cistercian order was founded in the 12th century really as a reform of Benedictine monasticism. And one of the integral observances of Benedict's rule is the balance of prayer and work, which is sketched out in chapter 48 of the rule. It opens like this. Idleness is the enemy of the soul. Therefore, the brethren should be occupied at certain times in manual labor, and again at fixed hours in sacred reading. End of the quote. Benedict continues that, quote, monks are to live by the labor of their hands, but let all things be done with moderation. And that, as we friends of Benedict know, is the hallmark of the rule of Benedict. It's moderation. It reflects the traditional Greek philosophical value of moderation in all things, and it invites us to a balanced life. If you clock the program which Benedict outlines in the rule, you will discover a day that is almost perfectly divided among prayer, which is the monk's primary duty, and I think the Christian's primary duty, work, study, and rest. Prayer, work, study, and rest. In his talk to his novices on chapter 48 of the rule, Merton said, the monk has three main obligations: choir, lectio divina, spiritual reading, and manual labor. Their importance graduated in this order: prayer, spiritual reading, work. Spiritual reading is for the monk's own interior life and spiritual formation. Manual labor is for the good of the community. We work for the good of the community. We work to support ourselves and our families and to keep the society going. We pray and we study so that we will be spiritually enlightened as we do the work we do. And this is all, Merton says, to be carried on in an atmosphere of peace and prayer and sacrifice and self-dedication. So I sit down and I think to myself, really, Bonnie, how recently have you lived 24 hours equally divided among prayer, work, reading, and rest? My confession to you is my besetting sin is overwork. I can hardly sit down to read, which I love to do, because there's always one more thing that needs to be done. You know, a day that is divided into quarters like that sounds like heaven to me. Most of us not yet retired worldlings spend most of our time working, both at our remunerative work for money and working at just what it takes to live in the world, which has gotten a lot harder for us in the last 12 months. Housework, grocery shopping, laundry, getting the state inspection sticker for the car, make your list. We, of course, in the old days, never missed Mass or Sunday worship. But how much time daily did we or do we devote, and I chose the word pointedly, to prayer and spiritual reading? Or how many of us get the 7 to 8 hours of sleep or rest that the medical people tell us is necessary for good health and is really good for our immune systems? Fact is that most of us live out of balance lives. And if we are unbalanced, our families will be unbalanced. And if our families are unbalanced, our societies and our nations will be as well. Merton worried about this in the monastery. His journals of the mid-50s to the mid-60s are full of references to what he observed as an unhealthy emphasis on work and the automation of work. Even in the monastic community, in the vowed monastic community, Merton worried about emphasis on the production of a saleable product. And it was an emphasis which could lead a monk to overwork, or an unhealthy emphasis on work that put the monastic life itself out of balance and resulted in the lack of leisure or spaciousness with regard to time that characterizes healthy monastic houses. You may remember his parody poem, I think that I shall never see a tree as lovely as a cheese, and he goes on and parodies that poem. Cistercian houses and Trappist houses understand that Benedict requires work because those houses have to be financially self-supporting. But the monastic wisdom for the rest of us is not just that we shouldn't work, because the fact of the matter is, for most of us, not working is not an option. We're like monastic communities. We have to be committed to our upkeep. Maybe we don't make cheese or fudge or fruitcake or whatever it is the monastic community makes, but it is appropriate for us to earn our living. It's very interesting. Cassian, one of the first writers on monasticism, reminded us that work is the anchor that stabilizes the heart. That sort of changes the way we think about work. It's not that we shouldn't do it, it's what stabilizes the heart. And if we had more time, we might explore the relationship of the work of our hands to monastic poverty, which anybody who's ever visited a monastery knows is not abject poverty. What is not okay in monastic wisdom is to live for the sake of work and not work for the sake of life. Like so many things, work is a wonderful servant and a terrible master. Monastic wisdom asks us to focus so far as it is possible within the requirements of our lives to make good choices for balanced lives, and not to focus on one aspect of life to the detriment of the others. So that's a good place to stop, to think about balancing life so that one aspect of life does not throw the others out of balance. So there are 3 points of monastic wisdom for the rest of us that I hope you might have heard this morning. First, our first task is to heal ourselves. Monastic life is a kind of convalescence, and to take on the values of monastic life that we read in the Rule of Benedict, which of course come directly out of the New Testament, is to begin the process. Secondly, and I really could preach this second point at some applied length, we need to be healthily skeptical about the mainstream, about the status quo, about the way things are, and especially our place in that. Where do we stand in relation to the status quo, politically or economically or theologically or ecclesiologically? Where do we stand in relationship to the status quo is a really important evaluative monastic question. And thirdly, how balanced is our use of time? That Benedict is really clear that life needs to be balanced. And that will be a point I will pick up at the beginning of the second talk. But now you have a little opportunity for holy leisure. Maybe make a cup of tea, maybe look at the questions from the outline, and then we'll reconvene quite promptly at 11 o'clock. So I'll see you again in a few minutes.
Unmute, start video. Okay, thank you, Bonnie, and everybody. I trust you can hear me now, and enjoy the next 20 minutes. We'll convene after that. If you've got burning questions or just questions or things you want to throw into the pot, go to the bottom of your screen. It says Q&A over on the right. Click it, punch it, type out your question, and we'll be processing that. Bonnie will not have to be looking through a blizzard of questions coming into you. Lane and I will be doing that, and then we will pass those questions on to Bonnie, and she can spontaneously, brilliantly respond to them when the time comes. Have a wonderful 20 minutes, and we'll see you shortly.
Do you want me?
Okay, I'll unmute and I'll start video. Hello, everyone. I hope you had a good break, a fruitful 20 minutes at home, and I will tell you that there's been some very interesting questions that have come in. So the Q&A is working. We're seeing your questions. We're sorting them out, and Bonnie will have a chance to address those after the second talk. So you can keep those coming, but you can also, as she begins the second talk, focus on that and bring any new questions or old ones you haven't yet typed in to us just after that second talk. Okay, so I think that's everything we need, and it's going to be on to the second part of the presentation from Bonnie Thurston. Thank you, and over to Bonnie.
Welcome back. I hope you've had a moment of leisure, a few moments of leisure in the last few minutes. We're taking question and answer at the end of both of the talks at the end of the day, because this is to be a quiet day. And if we start with our question and answer right at the beginning, I think we stay in our heads and it doesn't have a chance to sink down into the heart. So we're trying to give an opportunity for things to sink into the heart, but we will have some time to talk about this later today. I want to pick up again on the idea of the balance of life that monasticism offers to us. And I want to do it by reading a quotation from a great friend of Thomas Merton, Jean Leclerc. And you may know him. He wrote the book, The Love of Learning and the Desire for God. It's a classic work on monastic history, and you friends of Benedict, I highly recommend it to you. And here's what Jean Leclerc said. The whole organization of monastic life is dominated by the solicitude for safeguarding a certain spiritual leisure. I think that's just absolutely wonderful. The monastic life is organized in order to safeguard a certain kind of spiritual leisure. Spiritual leisure or holy leisure, that really resonates, doesn't it? It's what classic monastic texts in Latin call the otium, free time or ease, or maybe best of all, hanging out. It's something that lies between the extremes of obsessive overwork on the one hand and sloth on the other. And it balances the life of prayer and work. And monastic wisdom asks all of us to choose some unscheduled time as a way to escape the cult of overwork. I think it surely is what God had in mind, and I am not claiming to know the mind of God here, but certainly this must have been something that God had in mind when God commanded us to keep Sabbath, which is, by the way, a command I regularly break. And if you've not read Abraham Joshua Heschel's little book, The Sabbath, it's the best thing you've heard today. Quick, go and order a copy and read it. 1/7 of our time is by divine commandment to be set aside for our relationship with God. God only wants 1/10 of our money, but he wants 1/7 of our time. Unfortunately, we seldom make time for leisure. And if we do make time for leisure, it's often not for worship or prayer. Often our leisure is scheduled with things like competitive sport, like tennis or golf or hockey or whatever. And that keeps us in the same mindset that we have when we work. Neither Merton nor I can offer you a 3, 7, or 10-point plan about how to balance life and work. Neither he nor I are in that kind of thinking and writing mode. But Merton does say something in the basic principles of monastic spirituality that I think is very helpful, and it assists our discernment. And Merton writes, we need to help feed and clothe ourselves and our brethren, and also contribute to the support of the poor. We become helpers and cooperators with God, the creator and administrator of the world. We become instruments of God's divine providence. We help him change and renew the face of the world. You know, it might be interesting to consider how much time we could free up for holy leisure if you and I set aside the things we do that don't cooperate with God's plan for the world. How much more time would we have if we set aside the things that we do that don't directly cooperate with God's plans for the world? Let's presume that we accept the monastic wisdom of a balanced life, and we step off the overworked treadmill and we begin to cultivate the lovely turf of time set aside for holy leisure. What might monastic wisdom suggest about holy leisure? Well, I think it would suggest that holy leisure should include things that are restful, that are life-giving, that are things that we love. Merton wrote in Thoughts in Solitude, the things we love tell us who we are. The things we love tell us who we are. This is a very sobering thought. I might be a hot fudge sundae or a Mozart opera. And it's a very sobering thought when combined with something he wrote in the same book. Your life is shaped by the end you live for. You are made in the image of what you desire. Your life is shaped by the end you live for. You are made in the image of what you desire. Whatever else holy leisure is in your balanced life, I think monastic wisdom suggests that it should include a certain measure of silence and solitude. And I want to preface this by 2 points. One is that silence and solitude are means, not ends. If you remember those terms from your freshman philosophy survey required course 50 years ago for some of us. A means, not an end. We're not quiet in order to be quiet. We're quiet for something else. And secondly, to speak to our current situation, because of the struggles many of us have had with isolation, I'm going to soft pedal solitude a little bit. I'm going to talk about it, but soft pedal it because it's been a real cross to bear for a lot of people. So, once again, these aspects of monastic wisdom originate in Benedict's rule. Chapter 6 of the rule is entitled On the Spirit of Silence, and it begins with a lovely quotation from Psalm 39. I said, I will guard my ways that I may not sin with my tongue, and I will keep a muzzle on my mouth. And the rule includes the beginning of Proverbs 10:19. When words are many, transgressions are not lacking, but the prudent are restrained in speech. When words are many, transgression is not lacking, but the prudent are restrained in speech. Speaking and teaching belong to the master, says Benedict. The disciple's part is to be silent and listen. And in probably the most important chapter in the rule, chapter 7 on humility, Benedict revisits silence as both the 9th and 11th degrees of humility. Quote, that a monk restrain his tongue and keep silence, not speaking until he is questioned, that when a monk speaks, he do so gently, humbly, seriously, in few and sensible words, and not be noisy in his speech. In Basic Principles of Monastic Spirituality, Merton talks about the need of monastic silence in order that the monk may be swift to hear and slow to speak. That's in the letter James, some of you will remember. God spoke his eternal word and the world into silence, and he wants us to receive his words in silence. Silence is for the sake of, or a means to listening to God and to our own inner voices and to others. People really need to be listened to and to be heard. And when we truly listen, what we're doing is taking the spotlight off ourselves and putting it onto others. And when we really listen, we are silencing the interior voice that wants to fix it, or to say, oh, me too, that happened to me. Listening is for the sake of the other. The monastic context of silence is the quest for God, but the principle holds for us. If we talk too much or distract ourselves too much with noise, even, alas, Mozart operas, when we might risk missing what's really important and what God wants us to hear. That's exactly the important point that Jesus makes in chapter 4 of Mark's Gospel. It's the parable chapter. And he is repeatedly saying, listen, hear. You know, you hear that parable interpreted it's about seed or dirt. No, it's not. It's about hearing. Go back and look at it this afternoon. None of us, especially those of us who are hearing impaired, can listen well in a noisy environment. The messages of the Holy Spirit are subtle, and they are often drowned out by the general racket in which we live, and it's racket which we often choose to generate. We live in a raucous world. Monastic wisdom for the rest of us suggests that we need to find opportunities for silence. In reference to, quote, Merton, in reference to an age when totalitarianism has striven to devaluate and degrade the human person, Merton spoke of the murderous din of our materialism. And it's murderous because it both encourages overwork and it obscures the life-giving word, capital W. Truth be told, we have a tendency to hide behind words. Merton observed, we put words between ourselves and things. Even God has become another conceptual unreality in a no man's land of language that no longer serves as a means of communion with reality. monastic wisdom for all of us teaches that too much talk and ubiquitous noise are not normal. They teach us that if we have no silence, we can't hear clearly. And if we can't hear clearly, we cannot know who and whose, capital W, we are. We can't hear God's loving voice calling our names. In silence, Merton says, God speaks my name. Unfortunately, we don't remember much anymore Merton's contemporary Dag Hammarskjöld, one of the great figures, I think, in public life. And he wrote in his journal about being, quote, able to see, hear, and attend to that within which is there in darkness and silence. About the same time, Merton wrote, my knowledge of myself in silence opens out into the silence of God's own self. You know, great political figures of an earlier age, great monastic figures of an earlier age say that we have to be quiet in order to hear some very important things that we'll miss if we can't have some silence. And one of the most startling things that Merton wrote is God utters me like a word containing a partial thought of himself. God utters me like a word containing a partial thought of himself. For most of us, in order to hear that word, we've got to have some opportunities for silence. And to have opportunities for silence, many of us will have to have some solitude, and that is scary business. Because when I am alone, I am with me. Nobody else is there to buffer me from the less attractive things about myself. This is one of the root reasons why solitude and isolation and distancing has been so very hard for a lot of people. Because for a lot of people, it's the first time in their lives they've had to live completely with themselves. I've lived by myself for 30 years, and I really have trouble with my roommate. The good side of the solitude coin, and the one that is related to the matter of a monk as a marginal person, is that in recognizing the unattractive and broken and maybe even evil bits in ourselves, we are then able to do something about it. Monastic wisdom invites us to do that, to cure ourselves and then to be a source of healing for others. We know that by the early 1950s, less than 10 years into his monastic life, Merton felt a profound need for more solitude. And he was given by the abbot the permission to spend some days in a shed in the woods by himself. By 1965, he was given permission to live as a hermit. Nearly a decade before, he had written in No Man is an Island, the one thing that most truly makes a monk what he is this irrevocable break with the world and all that is in it in order to seek God in solitude. One of the reasons we're marginal as monastic people of wisdom is that marginality makes it easier for us to communicate with God. Think of all the people in the biblical record who went out into the desert and had a theophany there, who met God there. Spiritual solitude is related to skepticism about mainstream society and its given and its goals. So all of these aspects of monastic wisdom, as you can see, are deeply intermeshed with one another. But again, solitude's problematic. Unless you are Henry David Thoreau, people generally think of solitaries as losers, people who can't attract a spouse or a partner, social misfits, friendless, misogynists. You can go on with a whole string of unpleasant adjectives. But Merton and monastic wisdom suggest that we can't mature as human beings without some measure of solitude in our lives, because solitude goes hand in hand with the silence that's necessary for the spiritual growth we have through listening. In Notes for a Philosophy of Solitude, well worth your time reading, Merton wrote, quote, "Without solitude of some sort, there is and can be no maturity. Unless one becomes empty and alone, he cannot give himself in love because he does not possess the deep self, which is the only gift worthy of love." That is a very difficult and very practical statement, and it makes the stakes here very high indeed. Clearly, not only are many of society's ills rooted in the inability to be alone, but so are many of our personal ills. And if at this point you are thinking of Blaise Pascal and his statement that all the unhappiness of people arises from their inability to stay quietly in their own room, you are absolutely right, and you must send your high school French teacher who introduced and had you translate this phrase flowers. So many of our difficulties are because we just can't quite bear being alone. Now, before you say, "I live in a small apartment with my spouse, 3 children, a dog, a cat, and 2 hamsters," I would want to remind you that monastic wisdom that's being advocated here is not necessarily geographic or exterior. That we carry within us a certain internal spiritual solitude. And those of us who live in families or religious communities can still develop a healthy spiritual solitude. There's a term for this in Hinduism. It's called guha, G-U-H-A, the cave of the heart. And a lot of the teachings in Hinduism have to do with the solitude that we carry around within us and into which we can withdraw. In an essay on interior silence and monastic formation, a Cistercian called Brendan Freeman writes that solitude is not isolation, reclusion, or separation, but the solitude of the heart, which is always present. Merton also understood solitude as an attitude of the heart as much as it was a geographic situation or physically being alone. And he used the traditional monastic term recollection as, quoting, "almost the same thing as interior solitude. It is in recollection that we discover the infinite solitude of God dwelling within us." It's an amazing image that when we seek our own interior solitude, we find within us God's infinite dwelling in solitude. Sometimes I think on a bad day that there's a conspiracy somewhere to prevent the sort of silence and solitude that could lead us to spiritual maturity and inevitably then to a critical analysis of the way things are and what they say. We could all perish from a bad case of herd mentality. Not herd immunity, but herd mentality. I think that's what we saw on January 6th and why it was so frightening. We may not need so much to pack up and head off as to shut up and turn off. Monastic wisdom for the rest of us invites us to exercise the freedom that we have in our lives to choose. And if there's been a sort of Wagnerian leitmotif to the talk this morning, it has certainly been this urging of us to make choices, not to live an unexamined life, but to look at ourselves and our lives and our situations honestly, and then make choices, to refuse distractions, to listen under the exterior and internal racket of life, and to enter the silent cave of the heart and listen. Because then we can emerge with clearer insight and a more disinterested kind of love. And that's so key, this disinterestedness of our love. As Merton wrote in Contemplation in a World of Action, quote, Discipline means solitude of some sort, not in the sense of selfish withdrawal, but in the sense of an emptiness that no longer cherishes the comfort of various social idols and is not slavishly dependent on the approval of others. In such solitude, one learns not to seek love, but to give it. Do we cherish the comfort of social idols? Are we slavishly dependent on the approval of others? And does that lead us to be unable to be good lovers? Well, let me just say a few things in conclusion, and then you'll have a few more minutes to reflect. In the basic principles of monastic spirituality, Merton wrote, quote, "The monastic life is a search for God and not a mission to accomplish this or that work for souls. The monk fulfills his function in the church in proportion as he finds God in the peculiar way that God makes possible for him. The monk fulfills her function in the church in proportion as she finds in God the peculiar, meaning the individualized way that God makes possible for her, for each of us." And the quotation, I think, highlights three things that I've been suggesting, or I hope I've been suggesting, as essential to monastic life and to those of us who are friends of Benedict and interested in monastic spirituality. And the first is that our lives are really a search for God. That's what we're about. Secondly, that means that our lives are not about some mission to accomplish some goal. And thirdly, our lives are highly individuated. They're not one size fits all. They are the peculiar way that God has made possible for each one of us. We rejoice in our peculiarity and our individuality because, as St. Paul wrote in a fascinating phrase in Ephesians, which I've never heard anybody preach on, we are as he made us. We are as God made us. We are what we have to work with. This was how it was intended to be. If I've advocated anything this morning, and I don't think I know very much to advocate anything to anybody, but if I've advocated anything, it is that we each exercise our freedom to choose, to employ the freedom we have in the circumstances in which we find ourselves to live in ways that are more attentive to God and to the big picture, capital B, capital P. Many of us have more freedom to choose and a greater degree of volition than we actively use. It's so much easier to just skim along on the surface and do it the way that people expect it to be, and to be the people we're expected to be for our gender and age and status in society. It's easier to drift along and do the culturally expected things. And Merton's introductory essay in The Wisdom of the Desert describes how very dangerous this is, not only for us personally, but for the societies in which we live, for our nations, for our churches. I've also stressed that Merton does not offer us techniques, the few easy steps to enlightenment, which for only $99.95 we will send you, and if you send for them in the next 4 hours, you'll also get the Ginzu knives. That's not the way that Merton thinks about this. Merton thinks about this as a long, gentle process of the reorientation of our inner lives, the attitudes of our hearts. Monastic wisdom for monks and monastic wisdom for the rest of us involves transformation. And it's a transformation that happens from the inside out, not from the outside in. We have been considering really the hidden inner work that has to do with who each one of us is as specifically created and loved by God. I think monastic wisdom for the rest of us is basically about choice and about balance. In our particular circumstances, with our particular responsibilities, we are invited to choose to do what we can. As an aside, I don't think God asks us to do what we can't do. We're asked to do what we can to balance our lives, to bring into good order and balance prayer and spiritual reading or study and rest and work. And to do that, we're going to have to be more than a little detached from the way things are in the world. We're going to have to be a bit wary, or a lot wary, of conventional wisdom. The holy leisure, the quiesce, the restfulness or the recollection that is advocated by monastic life is likely to be found in the silence that for many of us, solitude alone fosters. COVID isolation has forced us into solitude. And it could be that one of the severe gifts of this time has been to force us to look at ourselves, to know ourselves in silence and solitude, and to examine our reaction to that. There is in this time a lot to suffer, and I think also a lot that we could potentially learn from about ourselves and about others and about the society in which we live. It is in silence that we can hear the very particularized voice of God to us, which, as the life of the desert fathers and mothers and the writings of Thomas Merton demonstrate, will often lead us to not only healing in our own lives, but to a deeper love of and service to others. Merton wrote this: if we want to be spiritual, let us first of all live our lives. Let us not fear the responsibilities and the inevitable distractions of the work appointed for us by the will of God. Let us embrace reality and thus find ourselves immersed in the life-giving will and wisdom of God, which surrounds us everywhere. What a hopeful vision, that God is here and present with us, and that the invitation to us is, insofar as we are able to do so, to order our lives toward the God who is present to us. And so now we have, again, a little break to make a cup of tea, to think about the challenges of monastic wisdom for the rest of us, to use the questions if they're helpful. And then we'll come back and have a nice length of time to have some questions and responses.
Just to say quickly, we'll come back after 11, right at 11:50, and we'll be reviewing your questions and preparing those for Bonnie. So keep sending those in if you have something you'd like her to address when she returns in person. Okay. Unmute and start video. Let's see. Okay, everyone, welcome back. I hope you've had a fruitful break. Bonnie is now with us in person. She's been with us in person throughout. It's just that the talk that you've heard, the two talks you've heard were recorded a few days ago. So welcome back to everybody. And we've got some questions. And we'll continue to, Lane and I will be processing those and kind of batching them together and preparing those for Bonnie to respond to. Can I start with a really easy, simple one? There's a name of a book mentioned at the beginning of the second talk, and someone wanted you to repeat that. Can you do that, Bonnie?
Yes, I think it was the book about...
I think you're still muted.
No, I'm unmuted on my...
oh, okay, sorry.
You may have to unmute me.
You sure she can hear?
You may have to unmute me there, yes. I think it was the book by Jean Leclerc, The Love of Learning and the Desire for God. Is that it?
I think that's it.
Yeah, Jean Leclerc, The Love of Learning and the Desire for God. It's the classic work on the relationship between monastic life and the rise of certain kind of spirituality and of the universities in the medieval world. It's an absolutely wonderful book. And Leclerc was a good friend of Merton's, and there is actually a collection of published letters between Thomas Merton and Jean Leclerc.
Great. Bonnie, here is another question that relates to the 4th century desert fathers and mothers. You made such a powerful and beautiful point that this was all about self-healing. It was about cure. And then following that came both the power and the obligation to pull others up. And
yeah, that's Merton. That's not me. I'm just channeling.
Right, but you distilled that from Merton. The question came in, did they want to get away mainly, or did they see it, those 4th century fathers and mothers, did they see it as first healing themselves and then healing others? Did they see it in the same way, do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a thoughtful question. We know from history and from the collection of the sayings of the desert fathers and mothers that they really did want to get away from the dissolution and the to get away from the crumbling Roman Empire. Whether or not they knew that their healing was for others is a hard thing to say. I can't quite crawl into the heads of those 4th century people. I have read several different translations of the sayings of the desert fathers and mothers. And the language of a lot of the sayings is the language of curing, of getting healthy. What we know for sure is that people went out into the desert to join them and to stay, and other people went out into the desert to ask them questions, to seek their wisdom. So there was an interplay between those who had left the world. Of course, they were in the world, they were just in it in a different way. As long as we're alive, we're still in the world. But people did go out and ask them for wisdom about all kinds of things. And it was at that point, I think, that the desert Christians' self-choice became healing for the society. And it also is reflected in the fact that we still have those sayings. You know, through all these centuries, really, those sayings have been points of wisdom and healing and insight for all kinds of people. So I highly recommend to you Merton's collection, Wisdom of the Desert. And the other one that I think is very accessible and helpful is Sister Benedicta Ward, SLG, Sister of the Love of God. Sister Benedicta Ward has a collection of sayings that may just be called the Desert Christians or the Desert Fathers. But I think when you see what was recorded of what they said, you see both the impulsion to get away from something that was rotten or rotting on the one hand, and something that on the other hand was very life-giving and healing on the other.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
That's
and
a
also
good question.
Yeah, it's very interesting. But I think that, the proof is in the pudding, as
Indeed.
You say, the fact that these desert sayings, go on healing people. So they must have, had that in mind.
Yeah.
And I think also you made some very good recommendations of books. And there was a question that came in. Person says, I'm a beginner. I'd love your recommendations of a good start in how to learn about Thomas Merton. So in addition to Wisdom of the Desert and Sister Benedict Ward, anything you would add to that?
Now, this is a question, somebody who wants to know what the basic reading material for Merton is.
Merton. Mm-hmm.
We're really lucky. The Orbis Spiritual Masters series, Orbis Press has a series of books on people who are spiritual masters. And there's one on Thomas Merton, and I think you can't do better than to start with that book. It's edited by a Merton scholar who taught for many years at Nazareth College in Rochester, New York. She's called Christine Bochen, Bochen. And the book is in the Modern Spiritual Masters series. It's Thomas Merton Essential Writings. It has a wonderful introductory essay on Merton. And then Christine has chosen selections from Merton on all the different kinds of things he wrote about. So there's material on prayer, there's material on social action, there's material on art and poetry. It's a really good place to start. So that would be the first thing I'd suggest. And then just, my own prejudice is that New Seeds of Contemplation probably will be to the 20th century what Julian of Norwich was to the 14th, or Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross were to their centuries. It, I think, is really a genuine spiritual classic. So start with Christine Bochen's book, because I think that will be a wonderful entree for you. It's very accessible, and it isn't huge. I'm suspicious of huge books anymore. This is a little book.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. And speaking of little books, a beautiful little book is your last book, Bonnie. And the question comes in: life is shaped by the end you live for. You are made in the image of what you live for. What is the source of that quotation?
Pardon me? That's from Thoughts in Solitude. It's from Thomas Merton, Thoughts in Solitude. Yeah, you're shaped by the end you live for. You're made in the image of what you desire.
Right, right. Here's a question about one of the monastic realities, community. Mm-hmm. And the question is a very straightforward but a challenging one, I think. It says, what about when community feels like work?
Well, community is work. Yeah. There's no question about it. Community is work. We whether the community is a monastic community or a family, or the school where you teach, or the factory in which you work, and there is a kind of work to it. I think in healthy communities, whether they're theological seminaries or monasteries or offices, provide folks with an opportunity for a little solitude to get away from the community. The monastic communities that I know about and have been friends with, and I've been really fortunate to have close association with a couple of Benedictine and a Cistercian community, they provide opportunities for people to have a day away. You know, we need a little break from the people that we love most and that we're vowed to live with. But absolutely, I bet whoever submitted that question is probably a monk or a sister. But yes, community living is hard work. Marriage is hard work, which is not to say that it isn't lovely and life-giving and fruitful. But yeah, I mean, there comes a time in which the work we do to maintain community, we need a little break from. It's very hard. It's really hard work. Is that answering what the person asked?
Yes, as far as I can tell. Yeah, I think that was.
Yeah, it's really
and I think
it's really hard work. I couldn't hack it. I couldn't hack living in a religious community. I can do it for, 6 weeks or so, but I think it's very hard to be up against rubbing your elbows that closely with your brothers or your sisters constantly. But it's hard also to rub your elbows with your spouse or your kids day in and day out. That's part of the challenge of the life that we have chosen and the life that's been prepared for us.
Yeah, thank you. On the last question of the desert people in the 4th century, there's an interesting comment that's come in from Norveen Vest.
She should be giving these talks.
Right. Well, it's great she's with us. And she points out, she said, Peter Brown has an excellent treatment of the desert folks in The Body and Society, which is about the choice to be visible to the people of the valley below, especially regarding issues of gluttony and food limitations.
Interesting. I'm glad to know about that.
Yeah.
There's another book on the Desert Fathers from a slightly different slant that I highly recommend, and it's called The Word in the Desert. It's a study of how the desert monastics used Holy Scripture. And I can tell you 15 things about the person who wrote it, but I'm not able to right this minute come up with a name. But if I don't worry about it, it'll come to me. But it's called The Word in the Desert. Wonderful book.
Interesting. Now, there are a couple of questions regarding solitude, and I think I'll put 2 of them together, Bonnie. And the first is, how does embracing solitude help us see more clearly how we are hardwired to God? And the second question.
Well, can I do one at a time?
Okay,
That's
sure.
a big question. How does solitude help us to see more clearly how we're hardwired to God? That's the question.
That's correct.
I think that for a lot of us, solitude sets the distractions aside. I am not saintly in any way, shape, or form. And so when I'm this is an example, when I'm with somebody, sometimes their surface characteristics veil the face of God in them. Everybody who comes to us brings God to us, but sometimes they just rub us the wrong way, or they're packaged in ways that are different from what we would wish they might be. Solitude helps us, I think, to unveil. It takes away the distractions. It allows us, if we choose to do so, to listen more deeply and to see more profoundly the connection. And this presumes that we go into solitude, or we go into silence with the invitation that God will come to us. I mean, we go with not sort of tabula rasa, but we go asking God to be with us, to manifest God's self to us in the solitude. I think it's a matter, for me anyway, it has to do with distraction. I am less distracted from the God connection when I have opportunities to set the distractions aside, when I set them aside. And then the connection gets stronger, and the opportunity to be more directly, so that the signal is stronger, to use the wired metaphor. When the signal is stronger, then it helps me to be better prepared then to go back into the community, to go back into meeting with the people that I meet with, and then to bring that community to them. Does that make sense? Does that seem to address the question asked?
I think so. I
Okay.
think so.
And the second one was?
And the second one relates to this sort of ugly sister of solitude, which is loneliness.
Oh, of course.
And this person had said, I love solitude and silence, but I have discovered a deep loneliness.
Yes.
That's somewhere there.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts on helping loneliness become solitude?
Gosh, that really puts its finger on, I think, something really important, and it's the dynamic between loneliness and solitude. And each has its gift, and each has its danger, I think. I think on the surface level of it, solitude is something that we choose. Loneliness can come to us whether we've chosen it or not. Does that make sense? We can choose to be solitary. We might find ourselves lonely and we haven't chosen it. I'm thinking of a lovely old soul in one of the churches I had the privilege of serving in, and she was desperately lonely and she just hated it. And I think in the end, she didn't live as long as she might have because she suffered that loneliness so deeply. So I think in some way we must befriend loneliness. In the interior life, the things that we find most difficult are often the thing that we most need to befriend. Can I tell you a story from the desert tradition? I'm gonna, whether you want me to or not. It's about the monk, the hermit who lived in a cave by himself, and he'd gone off to visit his brothers on Sunday to have Eucharist together and a meal with them. And when he got back to his cave, it was full of demons, and they were all hungry for monk. So what did he think he should do? And he said, well, first he offered to make a little meal for them. So he cooked some lentils and gave that to them, and some of them left. And some of them were still hungry for monk. And so what to do? And he thought, well, I'll sing to them. So he sang the most beautiful chants that he knew to the demons, and all of them but one left. So he's befriended them by feeding them, he's befriended them by giving them something beautiful. But one of the most terrible ones, biggest mouth, sharpest teeth, was still in the cave. And so the monk went up and put his head in the demon's mouth, and the demon disappeared. It's a wonderful story. And it reminds me that sometimes the thing that I find most difficult, like loneliness, for example, the only way through it is through it. Befriend it. Get at the root of it. And since loneliness can be, both psychological and spiritual, at the psychological level, maybe getting professional help to talk about it is a good idea. Spiritual direction, or to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist to help get at the root of the loneliness. That's a way, I suppose, of putting one's head in its mouth. But that's a really important question, because some people do find loneliness so difficult and painful. And my hunch would be that there's probably a reason for that, and getting at the root of the cause of the loneliness might be the real cutting edge of growth for somebody. But that's not to diminish how difficult and painful it can be for people.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. There's a question about a point that you touched on, which is the need to understand our place in the status quo and the mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not meant to just be perceptive and skeptical about the status quo and the mainstream stuff, but we're meant to understand the role we play in that.
That's right.
And can you talk about,
Complicity is the word that comes to mind.
yes, complicities, exactly. Um, and a men's group that I'm part of read a book about called Bystanders that looked at the complicity of people in Europe during the time of the Holocaust, ordinary people being ordinarily complicit as bystanders for this. But anyway, can you say more about that? And are there books that could help people who want to explore this question of their own role in the status quo and the mainstream?
Well, I guess a couple of things come to mind. One is the complicity of somebody like me in racism. You know, if the current situation has taught some of us anything, it is our complicity in not actively being racist ourselves, but benefiting from the system which keeps brothers and sisters of ours from being able to be successful or having enough of the world's goods or even being understood as equal human beings. I think we have, in that case, to take it upon ourselves to do the hard work of first of all, being honest about our complicity in the difficulties of the world. What was my role in what happened, for example, on January the 6th? What of my neighbors, who of my neighbors have I not listened to? Or how have I been complicit in making a large percentage of my fellow citizens feel left behind? I mean, I'm not being, I think, facile when I say it, but we really have to we have to look really hard at ourselves. That image that our Lord uses of taking the beam out of our own eye is really pretty much spot on. Most of us have some visual impairment due to precisely where we fit in the status quo. Our vision can be impaired because we're poor and Appalachian. Our vision can be impaired because we were upper middle class and raised and educated in private schools. Our vision can be impaired by too much or too little. And so I think at a spiritual level, silence and solitude can be a means to help us see clearly where we stand in the world. And then once we know, we have the opportunity. I mean, I did say that part of the advantage is once we have some clear sense of where we stand, then we have the opportunity to make some decisions. We can say, right, I like where I am, I'm staying. Or we can say, oh dear, I'm complicit in the suffering of others. What can I do to change? I mean, it would, that seems very theoretical, but I don't think it is. I think each person has to look at where she stands or where he stands in relationship to the status quo and then make some hard decisions. And sometimes we have to be told. I have a good friend and she will tell me if the dress makes my bottom look big, I shouldn't buy that one. We need to have spiritual friends who will tell us that we're not as clear-sighted as we think we are. Does that make sense? Does that seem at all practical, Tim?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it does. I think,
I mean, it's so easy. It is so easy to just drift along and be what you're supposed to be at each stage in life, at your socioeconomic level, in your race,
absolutely.
in your cultural background. It's just easier to do what you expected to do.
Right.
To step out and to not be what you're supposed to be as a 45-year-old woman is harder than just going along. It's if you're going up the corporate ladder as an executive in a company, it's just easier to go to the next rung than it is to ask the question whether, well, when I get to the top, is there anything really worthwhile that I'm going to get? You know, or how is this company for which I work and in which I'm, making growing up the ladder, how is it doing anything helpful for the larger world?
Right.
I mean, am I working?
Yeah, I'm very struck, and I don't know how others, I'm sure others are too. Your question, what was my role in January 6th?
Yeah.
I think, it's,
I mean,
everybody looked in shock, horror. I don't know. I can't believe.
No, everybody didn't, Tim. Nobody didn't look in shock and horror. A lot of our neighbors looked and said, oh, good. Finally, somebody's doing something.
Yeah.
Excuse me, go ahead. I mean,
well, I know that. But then do we in turn look at those neighbors in shock and horror and say, why are you seeing it this way?
Well, you see, this
as opposed to, did I have a role in bringing this whole crazy thing about? Where was my complicity in that?
Yeah, well, you see, this is where we're situated makes us see things differently. I'm right in the middle of the Trump supporting red state. And I have chosen to stay here because if I move into the coastal liberal educated parts of the country, I will lose the day-to-day contact with the people who don't really see the world like I do. Do you know what I mean? So many people who reacted as they did on January the 6th don't have any day-to-day contact with the folks who went from the reflecting pool to the Capitol. I mean, those are people I need to listen to. I need to, I don't have to agree with them, mind you. Don't misunderstand. I'm not justifying that kind of violent and illegal actually behavior. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that I feel personally, I need to hear where that comes from. I need to know why those folks feel so alienated from what would be the mainstream in Washington or New York or Boston or Philadelphia or San Francisco, but is sure as heck not the mainstream in Western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Southern Ohio. Think about the areas. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right.
There's a human root to this that we must not, as Christians, lose touch with.
Yeah. Good. Thank you. Another question came in earlier about being on the margins. Mm-hmm. And this person said, seems to me that marginalists get crucified.
Oh, yeah, sure.
What do we do about some of the dangers of being marginal?
Know that they are a danger. Know that when you choose to do that, you will suffer the consequences. Jesus in Gethsemane comes to mind. Gethsemane's on the road to Bethany. All he had to do was go up the hill and across through Bethany, and he could have gone right on back up the Jordan Valley, and he made a different choice. So absolutely, I mean, there is absolutely no question that there is a cost to choosing marginality. It may be loneliness, to tie it into another question. When you begin to make decisions that are not part of the mainstream, your friends will maybe not understand. Some of them will suddenly not be around anymore. But yes, marginality comes with a cost. That's the way it is. And each of us have to decide how much we're willing to pay. I hate this commercial metaphor, but it sort of works. Yes, indeed. There is a cost to this. But to quote the African American church, if you can't bear the cross, then you can't wear the crown. That seems to me a hard fact of Christianity that we would like to sort of smooth over, but there it is.
Right.
The cross is at the root of Christian spirituality. It's right there. Right there.
Yes. A suggestion comes in on the Desert Fathers and Mothers, a book. It's called The Word in the Desert, Scripture
Yes.
and the Quest for Holiness in Early Christian Monasticism. The author is Douglas Burton Christie.
Doug Christie, that's the book I mentioned. I couldn't think of the name
okay,
of the
okay.
author. That's exact. Thank you, whomever sent that in. Douglas Burton Christie, The Word in the Desert. That's the book I was trying to remember the author of. Thank you, somebody.
Right.
Okay, maybe one more question. We're sort of coming to the end of our time, aren't we? Here by my watch, anyway.
Yes, I think so. We're aiming for 12:30 to close up.
Okay, how about one more?
Okay. Here's a question that relates to something you emphasized a lot in the second talk, which was choice. Choice to live this more balanced, monastically wise life. How do we get to this choice point? How do we do it? Practice?
Mm-hmm.
What? Thank you. How do we get to the choice point?
Yeah, I got you. First of all, you start small. The premise is that we all live within certain boundaries. We don't have absolute freedom, which is a good thing. We live within certain boundaries. And so we make our choices within the context of, for example, vowed marriages, or being parents, or being single people, or, there's a reality check that we have to look at and say, this is who I am. These are the circumstances that bound my life, or that surround my life. And then, first of all, we realize that we have a lot more choice often than we exercise. Nobody makes anybody that I know of watch 4 hours of violent television every evening. You have the choice to turn that off. Nobody makes you drink 6 martinis. You may need a little help as you move back, but when I started to play the piano, which was many, many, many years ago, I didn't start with the waltzes of Chopin that I ended up with. And by the way, quit on. That's when I stopped playing the piano, because I just couldn't do them. And I thought, okay, that's it, I'm done. But there was, 35 years from the beginning. I started with John Thompson, book 1, and then you move up. And as we begin to have a more considered life, in which we exert more active choice, we start, I think, in smaller ways and work up to the larger ones. It's why there's a novitiate in monastic life, because young novices, they work up to the wisdom of monastic age. And so I think the most important thing is to recognize the desire for the change. Something in you has ignited a little spark that makes you, or that gives you a sense of impulsion about something that needs to change. I think it's the Spirit of God resident within us. That as we open up the heart more and more, there is more connection. The wire, whatever the image of the first question was, the hot wire gets hotter, and we respond to one thing and it leads to another, and and it's sort of triangular. You move out this way, life gets bigger, your areas of concern get wider, but you don't start at the end, you start at the beginning. So find people that have the same interests that you do. Get to be a friend of Saint Benedict. Find people within that organization with whom you can speak about these things. Read the works that help as you go along, but take your checkbook and really look at how you're spending your money. Worse, take your date book or your whatever it is on your hand computer. I still use a paper calendar. I know it's hopeless, but that's how I do it. And actually look and see how you're spending your time. I think a lot of change begins with a little honest analysis first. You step on the bathroom scales and then you look at the chart your doctor gave you. But you start by really taking a hard look and as honest as you can manage, look at who you are and where you are and what you feel called to. And then the movement begins and you'll be supported in it. Strength and companionship and courage will come just when you need them. The Lord says, when you're questioned about what you're going to say, don't worry about it. I'll tell you when the time comes. That's a paradigmatic story. That when you begin to do the changing, the wisdom will come, the courage will come. The key thing is the initial decision to respond to the stimulus, which is God's call to you. We respond, we don't initiate this. The initiatory energy is God's energy and God's love, and then we respond to that. And before I sign off and let Tim have the last word, I just want to say in person that it's been absolutely lovely to be with you in this very peculiar way this morning, but I've really enjoyed it. I'm so grateful to Tim Carrington and to the Friends of Benedict for the invitation, and more grateful than I can possibly express to Lane and to Erica for doing all the technical things to make it possible for us to be together. So thank you so much for being part of this morning, and thank you, Friends of St. Benedict, for being my friend over all these years and for allowing me to share with you today. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, so Bonnie, thank you. I think I don't know what our numbers are as we finished up, but it's a lot of people. It's about 100. And I think at this point, if you wanted to ask all 100 of us to come shovel your driveway, we would all say yes.
Well, as a matter of fact, it's been snowing all morning. So
has it really?
I have my boots and shoveling clothes lined up to go out and do a little bit of that now. But
okay, well, we wish we could help you. We would if we could. You've really left us feeling that many things are possible that we may have assumed were not possible.
They are possible.
Barely possible.
Yeah, they're possible.
The scope of choice is more than what we thought it was. And the fruits of solitude are just always there waiting for us.
Yeah.
I love your last thought about recognizing the desire for change and possibly seeing that as the spirit resident in us.
Oh, it is, absolutely. Yeah.
But this has been so rich. You've been so generous. And I think people want more, but they can get more by going to the YouTube and maybe going through this again. We'll put up some things on the website with respect to books and make it easy for you to order some of these books from the publisher.
Why don't you give people the address of your website in case not everybody has it?
Okay, Benedictfriend, one word, .org. And if you put in Friends of Saint Benedict, it will lead you to that. Even if you forget that and get the word wrong, you'll get there. So if we were having the usual annual symposium on Benedictine spirituality, we stand up now and stretch and start talking with each other, and then go spend the next 2 hours eating a lot of really good food and exploring all of this further. And I look forward to the time where we can do it that way again. But in the meantime, this was a fabulous substitute for that. And I think that bringing people in to this conversation in their own homes and having Bonnie comfortable and warm and safe in West Virginia joining us was really a lovely thing. Thanks again to Lane and Erica for everything they did to bring us together. And special thanks to Bonnie, of course, and to all of you for being part of this 9th Symposium on Benedictine spirituality. Be safe, be well, and we'll see you next year. Okay.